This is the Overton Pod, and I am Jonathan.
And I'm Kanthan.
There we go. I didn't even have to introduce you. I thought for a second there, you might have forgotten your name. There is an age discrepancy here.
There certainly is, but I'm not going to let your youth and inexperience get in the way of this conversation.
Wonderful. The haters will love that comment. All right, so second podcast in. I had a bit of listening to the last one. It's interesting to dust off the cobwebs after having not done this for a while. Your feedback?
I think that the people that did take the trouble to sit through the hour, and it's a big ask these days to get people to sit through an hour, and surprisingly large number of people actually did it. And all of the feedback I got was pretty positive, and they seemed to think that there was really a definite case for something that was diving into almost a behind-the-scenes philosophical overview of what's going on in the world in general, which is essentially what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
So I think it was a good start. The question, of course, of where we take it from here becomes kind of more interesting. I've got a bunch of stuff lined up for this week, which I've tossed in your direction, and I know you've got the same. So let's see where it goes. The interesting thing is going to be keeping it within an hour, I think, because we don't want to stress people out too much.
We can push a little bit, but yeah, I agree. It often ends up being a little bit long. Some people love the long format stuff. Rogan proves that to an extent. Although I would say that there's certain podcasts that do very well of his, obviously, and that's usually based on who the guest is.
Yes, I tend to leave out his MMA stuff by and large.
I think everyone does, except the people who love MMA.
Sure.
I also leave out a lot of the comedians. I know Rogan's got a lot of time for them, but I've never found most comedians to be very insightful human beings.
Well, exactly. We have our comedians in Parliament, and look where that got us.
Well, and of course we have no comedians in South Africa anymore because they all have to be woke and politically correct. And so generally they're not very funny because when you can't make fun of stereotypes and you can't make fun of individuals for whatever their characteristics are, then comedy kind of flies out the window. This is the same reason why you don't find good comedies coming out of Hollywood anymore. I had people lamenting Oscar week, and I didn't watch. I just saw the terrible clips come out of it. I do think it was a better year for the Oscars, I must say that, because Oppenheimer was a sort of standard Hollywood film. Although I have my thoughts on that movie as a whole, I think probably you can argue between Tenet and that actually Nolan's worst film. But the interesting thing is it was a more standard sort of Hollywood film, and so Oppenheimer won the majority. It was kind of very run-of-the-mill Hollywood. It wouldn't have been surprising to see an Oscars like that in terms of the awards that were given out 20 years ago.
There were a lot of chest pains around the fact that Barbie didn't end up winning more Oscars.
Yes, because, of course, that would have been the woke thing to do. Greta Gerwig wrote and directed, and, Barbie, which really wasn't particularly a great film, but that would have been the woke thing to do, give the director award to the woman, and raise up the movie about female empowerment. But if you spend some time watching the Barbie movie, as always, you end up getting the reverse thing kind of happens often with these films, where they try to push one narrative and they actually push completely the opposite narrative. So Barbie, in my opinion, tries to push this very pro-feminist, third-wave feminist movement narrative, and ends up pushing a narrative where Ken is the hero, and essentially it's a very old school idea of the guy comes to the rescue. If they'd cast more of a soy boy in the position and not one of the best looking men in the world, who happens to also be ripped, perhaps they might have pulled it off a little bit better. But yeah, so that was the week Hollywood stuff, and as part of that conversation that was going on a WhatsApp group that I'm on, there was a lot of talk about the movies that used to be made and the stuff. If you go look at Best Picture from 1990 to 1999. The sort of films that got nominated into that category, and you go look at the last 5 years, there just is no comparison.
Well, let's go slightly further back, because there was this attempt on the part of IOL to brand Karen Moon as the Leni Riefenstahl
Yes, I did see that.
of South Africa.
I did see that. Quite ridiculous.
And I said, guys, you don't have a frigging clue, and let's just put aside Hitler as just purely as a filmmaker.
Can't put aside Hitler. 2024, Kanthan.
Let's put aside Hitler, okay? Leni Riefenstahl as a filmmaker, my God, the influence this woman has had on movies ever since. I mean, if you look at all of those scenes in Lord of the Rings, you take the scenes in Star Wars of just, the masses of troops lined up and ready to take to battle.
Yes.
All of that first got to the screen. Yes, the imagery, the sheer power of that imagery all came from that particular movie.
The Third Reich.
Yeah,
basically.
from the Third Reich, from Triumph of the Will. Yes. And, shows you the power of filmmaking, where you can take a cause as horrendous as the Third Reich and actually build this aura of invincibility and power around it. And it's kind of unsurprising that, Hitler believed his own propaganda.
Well, I mean, didn't we see a little bit of that? And we do it with all political parties, but didn't we see that at the EFF? What was it? Their rally or whatever it was last year with filling up soccer stadium, FNB stadium, and you had Malema coming out of rising up from the stage and all that kind of stuff, and that sea of people. It's similar type of imagery. Obviously, all the parties try to do it. The DA does it. They usually do it in a convention center. They're very run of the mill. Don't want to do anything
But they've
too
never
fancy.
been able to disguise Steenhuisen's boop. That's the thing.
Yes, too many pies and Coke every day at the engine. But let's get back on. I do want to talk about something related to that, but I wanted to just that the point around the Oscars was a lot of the stuff that comes out now is just not very appealing. I was on a plane recently overseas, and you get on the plane and there's nothing to do, and you look at
John, as a Jewish person, you have a relatively young culture compared to mine, but you really need to take a look at the stuff that is coming out of India. In terms of powerful filmmaking.
Yes.
My word.
Yeah, but they just sing and dance a little bit too much for my liking. I've never been into the musicals. But it's, you sit down now with a litany of stuff to watch, and there's very little stuff which appeals. The content is just not that appealing. And if we were talking about comedies and how much stuff there was, how much content, and just great, really brilliant comedic genius that came out in the early 2000s. Very silly stuff, some of it, and some of it that'll last the test of time, but just great stuff. And really, when last did you see a comedy that just kept you laughing for 90 minutes?
Well, a lot of the stuff that take Richard Pryor as an example, or Eddie Murphy, and the type of stuff that they did would never fly on stage today.
Yeah. Probably
and
not.
The world is poorer for it.
Yes. So that's what I'm saying. I think the content as a whole, the Oscars as a whole, everything that comes out of Hollywood at the moment is so throttled that it ends up being an inferior product, and it really shows. But on the politicians and their boops, you did a burning platform recently. And I'm going to focus in on Herman Mashaba, who the burning platform was with, but I think it applies to all of our politicians, and a problem I have with our elections that are coming up. So you got into a conversation with Herman. Obviously, there was the usual stuff that happens. This is what we're doing for these elections, and this is what we expect, and all that kind of stuff. But you tried to ask some substantive questions. You pointed out that when he was mayor, all you wanted done was the potholes to be fixed and the curbs to be cleaned. And that seemingly was a task too much.
And fix the traffic lights was the third one. Just three things I wanted.
Yeah, that's the only three things. I actually, as a taxpayer, as a ratepayer in the city, I happen to agree with you. If you came in and did just that, I would probably think you were a great mayor. Yes, my bar is very low at this point, but we don't get that. So I would.
But people actually don't get the knock-on effect of a simple thing like having traffic lights working. Because if you consider that every high-wage earner who is sitting in traffic, every minute lost there is a minute of productivity that's lost that's actually cost the economy. And consider that GP and Johannesburg in particular, we generate 50% of the GDP of this country.
Yeah.
And to put this in perspective, that is greater than the GDP of all the SADC countries put together, just in terms of what comes out of Johannesburg alone.
So what you're saying is Gauteng should secede.
Gauteng should secede, absolutely, yeah. Firstly, we should secede, and then we should develop our military capability, and then just, conquer Lesotho for starters, because we need the water from there.
Yes, the water, definitely.
Yeah, and but that's pretty much all we
And the
need.
hydroelectricity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's pretty much what we need.
So you had this conversation with him, and you mentioned those things, and he gave this terrible answer about how there just wasn't budget to do those kinds of simple things, and there was a deficit, and there's all these excuses, and it wasn't very useful. But the problem I really had with the conversation was it then went into kind of ideas about what he might do in power, what his policies are, what his positions are, where he actually stands. Now, for those who don't know, Herman Mashaba was obviously, what most people do know is the business that he owned, hair care products. But what they don't know is that for many, many years, 2 decades, I think, he was part of the Free Market Foundation. And under Leon Lowe, I know there have been some changes there, and I couldn't be bothered to get into that. But Leon Lowe is a very much, in a South African context, right-wing character, in the sense that he has what would be considered they're liberal, they're classically liberal.
Leon Lowe actually started off as a classic lefty.
Yes, he did. But then he realized, we had him on the Renegade Report, but you can go find that podcast probably 5-6 years ago. But the thing he realized was that freedom and liberty, essentially, what you would sort of see out of your standard American conservative today. Freedom and liberty are the only ways to get to prosperity. And that's really what the Free Market Foundation stands for. Happy to correct that if anyone from FMF thinks I'm wrong on that point.
Well, I used to donate money to the FMF back in the day for precisely that reason.
Yes.
Because, and I told Mashaba too that they had done this project where they were handing title deeds back to people, and they were looking for people to sponsor the title deeds. Yeah, the Kaya Lam project, which was in Paris, and I sponsored 3 of those properties. Just because the immediate impact of doing something as simple as giving people title deeds to their own property means immediately they can go to the bank to raise money to then improve their property. Security of tenure, it gives them something they can improve on. Absolutely. To pass on to their kids. And everything flows from property rights at that most basic level.
Yeah.
If you want the most fundamental thing to put into any constitution, just put property rights right at the top.
Absolutely. So, you brought that up, and you brought up a lot of these sort of liberty, freedom types of ideas. And Herman didn't seem to understand them very well.
No, I discovered to my horror that he's a closet communist.
Yes. So this is what I'm getting to. It's quite amazing. A lot of the responses he made were very sort of socialist, communist type ideas, which are completely against free market principles. And you even raised the fact that this is not free market. This is centralized control, which was what he was advocating for. And he didn't get it. I was quite shocked because it wasn't like he was saying, I've changed my position and I'm now sort of more on the left, or I've moved to a position
which
where
I would have been willing to respect, because
I would have fired up the helicopter. But yes,
40 years ago I was a lefty, and eventually you end up growing up out of those things.
Yeah, usually after your first paycheck and the PAYE written next to it. But
no, actually, it's when you become a parent, because when you realize that you've actually got to be doing stuff for the next generation, and suddenly your perspective just shifts dramatically. You, at that point, do not give a shit about the masses. You are primarily concerned in providing for your family and for your children, and then your extended family, and then it kind of fans out from there. And it's a big wake-up call. I've told people many times, there's nothing that makes you grow up faster than becoming a parent.
If you take responsibility for that,
a good point. And we fall a bit slack in this part of the world at that level. But yeah, that's a good point. But I don't think there's much point in wasting much time on Mashaba, because.
So what I wanted to get to was the point I wanted to get to was, it's not just about him. because I'm going to get a whole bunch of hate from the Action SA people. Like, oh, you're picking on Action SA. No, it's not that. Mashaba represents a problem I have with all of our political leaders, which is that either they're unprincipled, so they have no foundational principles which direct them through the political world, which is a real problem because you can be convinced to do anything. For example, you might think that freedom of movement and association is really important and then get scared of a virus and then decide that freedom of movement and association doesn't exist for like 18 months. You may, for example, say your body is your body and I have no right over it. And then you might suddenly say, well, no, but now I want you to inject yourself with certain products. So you have to have principles. If you don't have principles, you're actually quite a dangerous leader. And my concern is that we have too many leaders who either, like Herman, show themselves up to be not what they seem to be, or they don't talk about that. So in the run-up to the elections, I have no idea where most of the parties are from a principled perspective. Now, people will say, well, go read the manifestos. Yeah, I have read a whole bunch of them. They don't make any sense because most of the manifestos are just trying to be ANC light because you don't want to piss off the voters. So you're turning around and saying, well, we'll keep your grants and we'll keep your free healthcare. And, NHR is a bad idea, but NHR plus is a better idea. And we can do NHR Pro, or we can do State Enterprise Pro, or we can do it better. If you're going to follow the ANC, then you're following communists. If you're not going to follow the ANC, then that's fine, but you need to explain what your grounding principles are. And I have an issue in that I think most South Africans have no idea what their own grounding principles are. And that comes to an extent from the fact that we don't have this conversation as a broader idea. We don't have the conversation. In America, at least they know that. I live in New York, and I buy coffee at the local Starbucks down from my apartment, and then I go to the subway, and I try not to get pushed onto the train tracks. I'm a liberal, and the conservatives are. I drive a truck in Texas, and I'm being very stereotypical here, but I drive a truck in Texas, and
not in Austin though.
No, not in Austin, but I drive a truck. I drive a truck in Texas, and I, carry a weapon on me at all times, and yeehaw, But at least they know who they are, and they know roughly what their grounding principles are. If you ask them a litany of topics, they can, based on where they stand politically from a principled perspective, they can say to you, "This is where I stand on that topic." South Africans can't do that. And I find it astonishing.
I think South Africans can do it. It's our politicians that can't do it, John. You've got to actually, distinguish between them. I think by and large, if you look at South Africans as a whole, we tend to be fairly principled. We tend to be very conservative as a nation, as a whole. We're overwhelmingly religious to a large extent, and the fact is that the politicians, by and large, don't represent the masses as a whole. It's as simple as that. I think the same is pretty much true in most countries that you go to these days.
So if South Africans are aware of their principles, why is it that they don't vote according to those principles more commonly? So I give you an example. Why isn't the ACDP polling at 20 to 30%? The ACDP is a Christian party. Christianity is the major religion in this country by far.
I think the ACDP would be polling a lot higher if the ACDP was getting out there more frequently. They certainly don't do that. The ACDP kind of has its particular niche, and it sits there by and large. Freedom Front Plus to a large extent as well. They actually don't get out there, and they don't do enough engagement other than this. And it's a very kind of conservative approach if you think about it. You just within your own community, and you do your lobbying behind the scenes, but there isn't a conscious effort, for example, on the part of the ACDP to reach out, as a very good example, to Muslims in the Western Cape, where I think on a lot of core principles that the ACDP stands for, they would actually find that that there's common cause. Look, they clearly disagree on the question of Israel, but everyone disagrees on Israel. So, putting that aside.
If you can get over that single issue, which really has no relevance in a South African context.
But the crucial thing, of course, is that, ACDP doesn't make that a core part of its political platform. Neither does the Freedom Front Plus talk that much about.
It just seems to me that we're going to have probably 10 million people go out and vote for the ANC. And those 10 million people don't live their lives the way the ANC would seek to govern the country and does govern the country. And so that is, what I'm referring to. Even DA voters, I think, the DA voters don't sort of, they vote as the opposition to the ANC. There's a lot of sort of historical stuff that goes into. I mean, a DA vote is in some ways just as historical as an ANC vote. So there's a lot of white people, for example, who are voting DA because that was Helen Suzman's party, and she was the good person.
I think the extent to which you have that historical vote there is actually pretty small now. So someone was it was Ronaldo Hoos, calls himself Ngambala now for some reason, but he was asking all of you guys who are bad mouthing the DA, who are you going to vote for?
Yeah,
and I said, well, I'm probably going to vote for the DA in the province because I trust them at an administrative level.
It's a management position.
It's a management position, effectively, and I'll probably vote for them.
The DA are the best middle managers in the history of politics.
Yes, and I'll probably vote for them again in the next local government election. But I won't vote for them nationally, just simply because of the fact that they do stupid shit like going to Ukraine and virtue signaling, and then writing to the Americans and saying, come and interfere in our elections. I mean, how... I cannot really believe how utterly stupid.
So it's interesting.
It's
interesting the number of things that the DA chooses to do that are they're not actually actions. They're virtue signals.
Yes.
So we have election observers at every single election we've ever had in this country. There are election observers, local and international election observers, including Americans. So to ask Americans to come here is pointless because they're here anyway, at some level, and always have been. But it's also equally hilarious to ask the Americans, who seemingly have their own election issues, to come and oversee our elections.
What do the Americans know about not rigging elections? You don't even need ID to vote.
Yes, in some places
I'm
you don't
thinking
need
of flying
ID to
across
vote.
to the US
And voting.
just to vote in the elections. Yeah.
I mean, I could, I can go and vote without an ID, and even my dead grandmother could vote for Joe Biden. So,
yes.
There's that.
And she probably did.
Right. All right. So let's just get off. So politicians and having no principles, just a real bugbear of mine. But let's talk a little bit about this chaos at Google, because you wanted to chat about that. So it's a couple of weeks old now, which is sometimes better to be able to reflect a little bit more and not take the issue in the moment where everyone is freaking out about it and it's become the moment of the day. What was your take on, well, those people who didn't see, obviously, we've got a situation where Google has been behind the eight ball with regards to AI for a little while now. And they essentially were, OpenAI was the leader. And even other people, Microsoft had come out with their own product, and Google was really far behind. So they've been working really hard to try and catch up. And obviously, the argument is that Google should be the leader in AI, because AI is all about data. It's what data you can feed into the system. The system can then feed off more data. More data means more accuracy and better response from the system, in theory.
Not necessarily, because
should be in theory. I mean, if yes, there's a whole bunch of technical stuff you've got to do with regards to AI and how you direct it. But in theory, Google has the biggest advantage, and they really haven't used that. So they come out and they launch their AI and they call it Gemini. They rebrand it as Gemini, and people very quickly notice that there is huge political bias in their AI. Specifically, look, it's everywhere. I mean, they took the image generation down because the image generation refused to produce essentially white people or individual white people. And if you asked it to produce pictures of Nazis, photorealistic images of Nazis, it would give you Korean Nazis and black Nazis, and it wouldn't give you white Nazis, because
if you
diversity is our strength.
In fact, one of the questions that was asked was to draw pictures of Boers in Soweto, 1976, and it drew black people.
Yeah.
And the sheer absurdity of it all. Look, let's back aside from Google for a second, and let's start off with ChatGPT, which really kind of turned the world upside down when it came out around about the beginning of last year, which is when it suddenly the public realized that this was a thing. And at the time, if you asked ChatGPT a very simple question, tell me 10 good things about Joe Biden, and it would spit it out happily.
Yes.
And then you say, tell me good things about Donald Trump, and it would say, I'm sorry, I can, as a large language model, I'm
unable to be involved in politics.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
So now, understand the reasoning around this is that the people who program these models put in place particular parameters, and the idea behind the parameters is that they're meant to be enforcing safety. So, for example, you don't necessarily want people to be able to go in and
tell me how to make a bomb and smuggle it onto an aircraft, for example.
Exactly. So ostensibly the parameters are there to protect people. So then consider the fact that Silicon Valley overwhelmingly is leftist. And the reason why they're overwhelmingly leftist is because the university system for the past 30 years has been overwhelmingly leftist. And so you have this entire feed-through of all of the bad ideas. It's basically communist ideas that have been, tossed on by the diversity, equity, and inclusion crowd, which then filters through into this idea of trying to engineer equality of outcomes rather than equality of opportunity. And in order to do that, you need to overcompensate in the direction of people as opposed to ensuring that merit is the basis of every decision, and the way in which you answer questions, first and foremost, is fact-based and not...
Yeah, so it's the abandonment of truth, which is the problem.
It is.
And in order to push that ideology, you have to abandon truth.
Right. So the first thing we have to consider is that this is not a problem that's unique to Google.
Yes.
It's a problem that is across the board in Silicon Valley. And the only major disruptor in that field was at the point at which Elon Musk bought Twitter, rebranded it as X, ripped out the Band-Aids that just showed this festering sore that was underneath of all of the bad ideas that had been postulating there. And
had been amplified, because let's remember, it wasn't more than about a year ago that the people who with getting a blue tick was all political. It was completely political,
and they would remove it if they didn't like something.
100%, and
all of that.
Twitter had an office in South Africa, and I happened to know someone who was very close to that office, and they were asked, "Please, will you give Jonathan a blue tick?" And they outright refused, and it was completely on political grounds.
Yep.
So
we need to back up a bit. So that's the first thing to recognize, that Google is not part of the problem. Silicon Valley as a whole is the overwhelming part of the problem. But we also need to step back. A lot of people have been loosely tossing around the phrase AI.
Yes.
And what we have to be very clear about, and people don't get this, is that we don't have AI.
Yes, okay, carry
we
on.
Don't have AI.
I'm interested.
So what we have right now are what are called large language models.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially what they do is they take an existing body of data. They then end up, and I'm using they clearly from the perspective of the models themselves, because, the models have no...
The models are they, them.
Yeah. And the models are they, them. And so the models themselves are incapable of coming up with original thought.
Correct.
And what would differentiate a large language model from artificial intelligence is that ability
to have a unique thought.
So,
which is why when AI came out, ChatGPT, so you said it turned the world upside down. I don't think it turned the world upside down. To me, it was a fad. It was a thing that everyone sort of looked at. And I know there's a whole bunch of people in business and other areas who've started sort of using it to help them produce work. But that work is substandard. Usually you can spot when it's written by AI.
No, here's how it has turned the world upside down. It does allow you to do a lot of
Mundane.
preliminary scanning at a mundane level. So, very good example.
It's the next level of Google search in some ways.
No.
Because it collates.
Let's back off a bit from that. So, very specific example that you couldn't get from Google search is that you could go to ChatGPT, and I still do this, and I would say, I do, website coding, and I would say, for example, I want to build a model in Drupal that is going to take a series of articles, scan through it for particular code words, and then generate a specific view on that and just give me the code template for that, which I will then tweak. And it does this very quickly, very efficiently. And then I go through the code. So what would normally happen is that, I'd be sitting in my code editor, which, happens to be something called Atom, which, does a lot of filling out of, ensures your brackets match up and all of that kind of stuff. But now what happens is that ChatGPT can do a lot of that stuff for you. So it's at that level, it is actually turning the world upside down because it's increasing efficiency for lots of mundane tasks.
Okay.
But we need to step back now and look at the Google scenario in the context of what you just mentioned, because Google has been the 800-pound gorilla of the internet for the longest time, because they did one thing and they did one thing well, and that was searching and indexing and producing answers. Now the situation is that you don't, let's say you happen to be a kid that's doing homework. You don't now go to Google and say, give me a history of what happened in the siege of Stalingrad, as an example. The kid will now go to ChatGPT and say, give me 10 bullet points on the history of Stalingrad that I can then present to my class, turn it into a PowerPoint presentation, and tell me what illustrations to use on each of those. And Google cannot do that.
Yeah.
So when I talk about the world being turned upside down, that's at the most fundamental level, because Google's business model for the longest time has been doing exactly what it does right now.
Yeah.
So Google has to, at this point, so they've got 95% market share right now. Understand that in terms of web browsers, web search.
Yes.
So you've got things like DuckDuckGo, which I use. There's Bing. The Russians have one, Yandex,
Okay.
and so forth. But Google has.
They've got
95% market
most people
share.
start open up their web browser and go to google.com,
Yes.
whatever their
In fact,
local specific.
Google pays Apple for the privilege of doing that, by the way. So again, they reinforce that into the business model. But to go back to the question of Google in of itself needs to come up with its own large language model, so that when you go into Google search and type in exactly the same things that you now ask ChatGPT, that the answers that will get generated are exactly the same thing. But the problem, of course, with Silicon Valley is that all of the safeguards that have been put in place by the programmers there reflect their own ideology. So, and at that level, Silicon Valley now is actually facing an existential crisis, because what people need more than anything else right now is the ability to actually process fact and to be able to make decisions on the basis of fact. So when you ask for a picture of the founding fathers, you don't want to see George Washington depicted as a Vietnamese person, which is one of the issues that we're dealing with. But now let's step further back from it and look at terms of the rest of the world, because one of the questions that people keep asking is what's going to happen to us in Africa, because there's this whole victim mentality. We saw behind the scenes and so forth.
Poor us.
Okay.
Shame.
Understand that the code for ChatGPT, the core code, with ChatGPT 3.5, the publicly facing one, is actually publicly available, because that was open source model. ChatGPT 4 is closed source, and there's a legal battle going on now.
Yeah, Elon Musk is suing them.
He's suing them. But the core code of ChatGPT 3.5, which actually outlines the way in which the model works, is there. And the thing is that right now, you and I can actually take that code and we can run it on our computers at home. The issue, of course, is that we don't have the internet bandwidth in order to be able to
feed it.
in order to be able to basically troll the entire internet.
Got to feed the
However,
beast.
however, if you are not being time sensitive, and if everyone right now starts building because that is the single biggest source of data. It's the open internet. If you can go out there and crawl the open internet, which all of us are able to do, just write a bot that goes out, crawls the open internet, and gets stuff. The thing that we're able to do as individuals is that we're able to be selective in terms of choosing our sources. So we don't want to just go out and do the entire internet. Yeah. If I, for example,
are you telling me you never hit the second page of Google?
No, I'm saying to you that if I look at the Overton Press Substack, for example, and I add that as a trusted source that I want my large language model to be indexing.
Yeah.
I similarly feed in particular parameters. I can tell it, go to these sites that are storing academic papers that deal with engineering. I'm not interested in the gender studies stuff. I wanted to look at engineering. I wanted to look at coding. I wanted to look at telecommunications. Yeah. And I'm able to build my own large language model that caters very specifically to stuff that I'm looking for. And it means that I'm actually not dependent on Silicon Valley in order to be able to do that.
Okay, but how many people are going to do that, Kanthan?
The point is not how many people are going to do that, but the extent to which there will be a critical mass of people who will then actually be able to form a living from doing that for people. So, let's say, for example, in some alternative reality where you're a medical doctor. I mean, I know you're an acclaimed journalist.
Of course, just an acclaimed journalist.
You're an acclaimed journalist, but if you were a medical doctor, I could build a large language model for you that would actually be going through studies that show the effects of particular drugs, for example, or surgical procedures, and just to ensure that what you are getting fed on a regular basis comes from trusted sources that you yourself are able to
Is what
curate.
you're describing not already happening? I mean, I'm seeing it in a lot of people I deal with, who are
and that's why I'm saying
industry specific.
Yes.
So they're taking AI, industry specific, and they're applying it to the industry. So I'm friendly with someone in the insurance industry, for example, who's using AI to design insurance products, but to tailor make them better to clients. That type of thing you're talking about in the medical field. So exactly that. I can see big medical publishers, Lippincott Williams, Voters Kluwer, those kinds of organizations, just if they're smart, will pivot from just publishing papers and journals. And what they'll start doing is create internal AI models, which will, instead of you having to search for papers, which is actually very difficult to do, the system, it's not difficult. It's very it's a large time commitment, and it's onerous because
the big issue right now in terms of academic papers, as an example, is they're not publicly available.
Yeah, so they're not publicly available. They usually have to pay for them unless you link to a university which pays fees to access them. But the other problem is let's say you want to go and look at the effect of cats on ownership on happiness, for example. Completely random. But if you wanted to do that, I'm sure there's probably hundreds of studies that have been done over time on something like that. There's studies on almost everything. And so what you would do is you would go into one of the large databases of all these papers, and you would then give it certain keywords, search terms, and you would say you would do something like feline, cat, those types of terms, and ownership and pet, and then you'd add those all together and then give you results, and maybe it comes up with like 300 results. Now, of those 300 results, maybe only 10 of those are actually relevant to what you're trying to do, and especially in academia, if you're trying to publish your own paper. Maybe you've done your own study on this, but you need to reference the previous evidence, what other papers have found. That's generally how academia works. It's continuous idea laundering to an extent. And so you then have to pass through those 300 papers. Now, AI makes that a lot easier. If you had an industry system which then allows you to say, look, I'm trying to do this. Find me what's exactly relevant, which are the papers, and not only that, instead of making me read through an average paper with probably 6 to 8 pages in length, usually somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 words. If you could just find me the relevant aspects of the paper, so that I don't actually have to read through all of it. And I think, for me, I see that happening already. And I think large industry, I hear your point, which sounds like individuals might get involved in those things.
No, I'm not saying individuals might. I'm saying that is going to be what's going to happen.
You think individuals will?
Yeah. So consider there's a combination of stuff that kicks in here, and Moore's law is probably the single biggest contributor to what happens. And Moore's law basically says that your
computer processing power
doubles within a 18-month period, and the price comes down correspondingly based on. But the specific point that you need to take a view on is, and I'll use Apple as the example out here, because Apple for the past couple of years have been rolling out their desktop machines with their own chips, and these processors that Apple is now putting into your desktop machines are blindingly quick compared to the Intel machines that are currently out there in the market. And what I'm very clear about is that the next iteration of stuff that's going to be coming out of Apple, because remember, Apple's been in a bit of a holding pattern for the past while. They haven't really come up with anything new for a while. Well, they've got these Vision Pro things.
That's their latest, greatest. But
no, look, and it's a great.
It does look impressive. The price is.
No, but that's the business model, because they are punting it as a premium product. For people who can pay $3,500.
But
it's a good market.
But the iPhone became a leader not by being.
Correct.
It was roughly
but if you look,
similar to the top of the range with BlackBerry at the time.
If you look at the difference between an iPhone 15 versus an iPhone 14 versus a 13, so I'm using like a 6-year-old iPhone 8 Plus, which I haven't bothered to upgrade because it does everything I need it to do, and there's no features that are coming out that. Yes. I don't want a better camera. I'm happy with the pictures that it takes, and that kind of stuff. However, if you look in terms of the impact of the Apple M series of chips that they are now putting in, and you combine that then with the ability to run a large language model on your own computer, so in my case, for example, I've got like 40 years worth of writings, and I want to very quickly to be able to cross-reference everything that I've got in my writings, and of course, I've got all of them archived, along with go through my emails as well and find matches in terms of where I've been talking about stuff, because there might have been a conversation that I had with someone around a particular thing that I was writing at the time, gathering research information and so forth. And suddenly I've got this personal assistant that's able to do all of that for me on my desktop. And I'm saying that that's going to be coming. And you're probably going to be first finding that model rolling out in terms of
who's going to provide it?
I'm saying that will be bundled as part of the operating system.
It'll come. Apple will give it to you, or Microsoft.
But the crucial thing is that it's yours, and the way in which it gets trained. You are the person who ends up training it.
So let's go back to, because this all started with us discussing Google and Gemini,
yes.
And so is your take that Google has amplified and increased the speed at which that whole process will happen, because so far AI has been a very corporate entity. So we don't have our own AIs generally. Most people, yes, I know if you know what you're doing with coding, you could theoretically do it. People don't do that. There's lots of things you can theoretically do with the power of your cell phone, for example. Most people just buy whichever product, the Apple, the I don't even know what other brands there are, because really, why do you not have an Apple phone? But people just buy the Samsung, they buy the Huawei, whatever they buy, and they use it as it was intended from factory. They don't tend to do fancy things.
Sure.
Most people, you can modify everything, but it takes a lot of effort.
So the level at which you're correct about Google is that up until the stage where the images came out, nobody had actually understood the extent to which Google was systematically erasing white males from their vision of society. And that's fundamentally what it came down to. Because you had a model that was completely incapable of generating a picture of a white male.
Yes.
And I think that that's
But it's not really. I mean, it's not just about the white male issue, because it's also
no, but that is the single most visible manifestation. You asked it to draw a picture of a white male, and it was not able to do so unless it was in a very specific.
What I'm saying is that it's why it can't do that. So it's not just because it's been told never draw a white male. It's because from the entire history,
except from the point of view of most people in public. For those of us who've been saying for the longest time that Silicon Valley is biased,
yeah,
until you had this actual, physical, visual depiction, and people suddenly say, "Okay, I get what you've been talking about," and so suddenly, the trust factor that used to be there in terms of just automatically going to Google,
yeah,
I think that it's taken a severe dent. And, the most obvious manifestation of that was at the point at which this broke, there was immediately a drop in Google's share price at that time. So the question is whether Google is going to be able to regain that trust. I don't think they will, and I'll tell you why. It's because if you look in terms of Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google's response to this, and he put out a letter.
Yeah, he sent a memo to the staff.
He sent a memo, and you look at this memo, and it was very clear. No, actually, you don't get it, because what people really wanted to see here was drastic action that was going to show that fact-based material has to be Google's selling point, which is what it used to be when it started out back in the day, and instead, what you were trying to say is that, well, we're going to do some internal reorganizing, but we're not actually eliminating the fundamental problem that existed to start
Well,
off with.
let me tell you. You talk about trust, and I hear you, but trust for me is downstream the people who produce product. So the problem Google has, and the reason why I think Google is now a flailing giant. Now, whether that means Google will die, and in 20 years' time we'll all talk about that company Google, or whether it will kind of repackage itself, sort of like what Microsoft did after all of the controversy over the terrible operating systems that they released in the 2000s and the Internet Explorer court case in the EU, etc. But the reality is that the entirety of Google is infiltrated by people who believe the stuff being produced by Gemini. This refers back to what you were saying about what the universities produce. So the problem is that entire development team, they may be engineers, they may be software developers, they can be very talented people.
It actually went further than that, John. So let me put this in perspective. So Google has a DEI team.
Yes.
So what would happen is that every DEI team member would sit in on every software development program.
Yeah.
So, you'd have something developing
And direct
Gemini.
things.
Well, it wasn't really directing things. So, if you draw a correlation with the Soviet Union, okay.
Yeah.
So, with the Soviet Union, you would have a factory that would be producing material, and then you would have the party deployee, the commissar. And the job of the commissar would be to watch what everyone was doing. Yes, the workers were controlling the means of production, but the commissar was there to take notes, and then the commissar would ensure that appropriate people who seemed to be following the ideas that the commissar had in mind would end up being promoted, and those whose ideas were considered to be verboten would be pushed aside. And Google literally has this. So
Yes.
every single software development team has a commissar. It's old-fashioned Marxism on steroids. And
But I would argue that even if you got rid of DEI teams,
Yes.
And all companies have them at some level today because of things like ESG, etc. The point is even if you get rid of them, the training that people have undergone means that their general view on the world, their general politics, lean towards DEI anyway, because they've gone through universities being trained in these types of courses. And so as a result of that, you can get rid of the DEI team. You can't get rid of the DEI ideas, because even the guys who and girls who are not necessarily DEI focused, that's not their job. You're being employed as a software engineer. They still were trained as part of, on their software engineering course, they had a course once or twice or 3 times a week or whatever it is, in which they went and were told all about essentially cultural Marxist topics. Whether it be anything on sort of this kind of revisionist history that's taken place, whether it be that all land is stolen or whatever it happens to be, you really, and this is the big problem with, for me, Gemini is a look into the issue you have across the entire industry and unfortunately across governments. So in 2016-17, I was very concerned that what was happening is we had trained all these people through the 60s and 70s. So what happened was, this is for a longer podcast, but really what happened is that the infiltration into the American universities of cultural Marxism, which was the idea that Marxism actually would not spread well through the barrel of a gun, but it would spread brilliantly through the educational institutions. And the best place to do that was the country with the most powerful education system, and that was the United States. And so through the 60s and 70s, this started really in the humanities, because the humanities are the easiest place to penetrate in terms of bullshit. Because the humanities are places where you have discussions about bullshit on purpose. And then you even produce art in that respect. And so it was very easy to bring this stuff into the humanities, and it came into the humanities, and it kind of probably even belongs in the humanities, because we need to be having those discussions. That's what the humanities are about. However, in the 80s, it started moving across into very much more formalized and professional sectors. Sorry to the artists and not calling you professionals, but the reality is it started moving initially into law. That was the next sort of jump. And so the lawyers started getting trained in this nonsense. And you see the result of that now, specifically in the United States, but we see it in South Africa too. We believe, for example, we shouldn't punish people for too long. We should rehabilitate them. How you rehabilitate someone who rapes babies, for example, is beyond me. I don't believe in that rehabilitation. I know there are probably psychologists out there who will tell me I'm completely wrong, and I don't care. There are certain people I don't think can be rehabilitated. But that's where those ideas kind of come from. That was the lawyers
Well, you forgot
originally.
to mention the psychologists as part of where the idea comes from as well.
But yes, so it went into law, and then it went into, and then eventually it went into the sciences, medicine, and then finally into engineering. Now, the biggest concern I had back to 2016-17 is that a lot of these people now were coming of age. So, you go to university, you do a degree. Our system for a long time now has been set up that if you don't have a degree, you're not important. And so if you finished your degree in the 90s, you now in sort of 2015 are 20 years into your career. 20 years into your career is usually where things start to take off, if they're going to take off. And the problem is we're now seeing the results of that. So we have people across the world, but again, I'm going to use the United States as an example because it's a very good data point, and it has a lot of information coming out of that country constantly. And that's why you see DAs, for example, who no longer prosecute crime. That's why you will now see all kinds of DEI stuff penetrating medicine, where we now have conversations about giving people care first based on race. These are actual papers being published. That's why you will now even see in engineering conversations happening about how you engineer things with DEI, which is terrifying. But just go look at Boeing, folks. But the biggest concern I had was the military, because once you penetrate the military with this stuff, once you penetrate government, because military is government, and the military really is the most powerful.
But you need to be grateful for that.
Why?
Because can you imagine if Joe Biden actually had a competent military at his disposal. No, really. And I use the example in the South African context as well. Okay, so 1994, at the time at which white South Africa handed over power, and let's be very clear, white South Africa handed over power, the ANC didn't take it. At that point, the South African Defence Force, not the SANDF, the SADF, was the sixth most powerful in the world, according to Jane's Defence Weekly. Okay. Right now, we're probably somewhere way at the bottom.
70th or something like that.
Yeah. Seriously, if Zimbabwe decided to invade us, they would
be in
walk
trouble.
all over us. Yes, we'd be in serious trouble. And that's brilliant, because can you imagine if Cyril Ramaphosa had a competent military at his disposal? We have the only military in the world where you're allowed to strike over unsafe working conditions. This is literally the case.
Yes, because war is very safe, Kanthan.
Yes,
war is very safe. All right, look, I hear you.
But
there are some benefits to that, but I think overall the impact is very negative. However, you think that Google has now sort of done its bit, and actually by doing this has opened up the entire space to democratizing AI.
I think that Google has now exposed the soft underbelly of the DEI crowd that actually controls the narrative. And you're going to increasingly have people setting up their own business model. So, look, let's be very clear. The Chinese are already doing it. The Russians are already doing it. India is not doing it to the same extent, but, rest assured that behind the scenes there are lots of coders who are already looking at getting into the space. And it's going to be a question of, so every country is going to end up building its own model, because that's the only way they're going to have data that they're going to be in a position to trust. And this in turn is going to filter down to individual corporates that are going to accumulate their own models. And those models are increasingly going to be multi-purpose. The stuff up for me is, as a Google shareholder, I've done very well with my Google shares. In fact,
until they release Gemini.
No, I'm just taking a look. Over the years, it's like, so I've had an 87% increase in the value of my Google shares. But just take the view that right now, Google's value comes from the fact that it controls 95% of the search market, which in turn translates into advertising revenue.
Yeah.
So if they control 95% of the advertising revenue on search, so even if Google loses 5% of market share, the sheer impact of that in terms of revenue from search is going to be massive. Okay, because right now people are going to be taking a look at it and saying, yes, we'll always imagine a world where Google is going to have more than 50% of market share. But the amount of money that's represented by that 45% from where Google sits right now to the 50% mark is massive. So I think there's going to be major impact that's going to happen at that point. You've already had Musk announcing that Grok, which is the model that he's building, is going to be completely open sourced, which means that anyone can take the code and run it themselves. The advantage that Musk has got is that the single biggest source of data in the world for current information is X, and so that's going to give Grok the edge in terms of.
I'd also argue it's probably
sets.
one of the best conversational models, although it's. There are many problems with the conversation that does happen on that platform.
Yes,
it's very much a conversational model which doesn't almost exist anywhere else on the internet.
So right now we don't have artificial intelligence. Let people be aware of that. And the second thing is that yes, use all of these models right now, but just recognize that in 5 years' time you're probably going to be running a model yourself, probably on your phone.
Yeah, look, I hope you're right. And I do hope that would decentralize it, essentially, because, that's really an important word for everything. Everything in your life should be at some level decentralized. In other words, you should control it. Nobody else should. It's the biggest problem of government, really, is that most governments, even the ones who claim to be liberal governments in a classical sense or libertarian governments, still want some sort of central control. And so decentralization is wonderful. I do hope it happens. I think my concern is that there are a lot of incentives to prevent that from occurring from the people who currently control it, the likes of Google, Microsoft, etc., because they can't monetize it as well potentially if they don't. And I will just point something out. I found it very interesting. Humans respond to incentives, but you have to decide what the incentive is. If you offer a 5-year-old 100 Rand, they or a lollipop, they will take the lollipop, okay? Because to a 5-year-old, a lollipop is tasty and sweet, and they enjoy it. And they have no idea what to do with 100 Rand. They have no idea how that translates into value.
I'm afraid that my 8-year-old would turn around and say, Dad, how many lollipops can I buy for 100
but
Rand?
that's 8. So 8 and 5 is I used the 5-year-old specifically. So the point I'm making is that incentives are interesting things in the sense that humans are completely driven by incentive. And that's, again, probably a discussion for another podcast, but I don't believe in conspiracies. I just believe in incentives. But you say, they'll lose 5% and 5% will have massive impacts on their cash flow and their profit and revenue. I agree, it will. The question is whether the DEI folk will care enough to stop. And
no, the answer to that is no.
Yes.
Yep.
So this is my concern, and I think they're in charge currently.
Yes, and that's unlikely to change. It's I think it's something that's built into the business model of these companies.
Yes.
It's look. I mean,
to me, they will crash and burn.
The most fundamental way in which you demonstrate this is the amount of money that Alphabet gives to the Democratic Party.
Yes.
In political donation. So that is the most visible manifestation of where the stuff actually goes.
Yeah.
But I think the crucial thing is for people to actually recognize is that Google is going to continue being the dominant player there, but increasingly people are going to be moving away from it.
So I think what will happen is they won't respond to that sort of capital incentive. But slowly, because they don't do that, they will kill themselves. In the same way as mainstream media has slowly killed itself over 20 years.
In the same way that Boeing is currently killing itself.
Yes, exactly. So instead of going, look, we don't need to have accountants running the show, and quality actually matters when you're building giant tubes that fly 40,000 feet, they refuse to correct, so they will crash and burn, literally and figuratively. And I think the same is true of Google. But you talk about being 87% up on your Google shares. Lovely.
Yes.
Maybe sell now.
No, not for a while.
But tell me where you are on Bitcoin.
Now, I won't tell you where I am on Bitcoin because so I dabble in Bitcoin, but I'm not a.
Yes, well, I would not be on the podcast if I didn't do anything but dabble in Bitcoin because you wouldn't know my name. No, I would be on a beach somewhere.
So I dabbled in Bitcoin to the extent that, so go back to 2017. So early 2017, I used to dabble in on the JSE. And, it was just something that, you do it for a period to try and get a sense of how it works.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was sitting with shares in MTN because, MTN was a good share and, a fairly solid business. And then early 2017, there was that entire Nigerian debacle that kicked in. And MTN took a 25% knock in its share price as a direct result of the fact that it needed to pay out, however many billions it was to the Nigerian government.
Yeah.
And so I was taking a look at my MTN shares, and I was then asking myself, right, it's lost 25% of its value. How many years is it going to take for it to get back to this level? And I couldn't see it happening within a 5-year period. So I sold those MTN shares, and then on impulse, I put those shares into Bitcoin.
Okay.
And within 2 weeks, the price of Bitcoin doubled.
So you got your 25% back and then some.
Well, no, at which point what I did was I just simply pulled out the 40,000 Rand that I had originally invested and left the other 40,000 in there. And since then, over the course of the years, I mean, kind of
Up and down.
I've been pulling money in and out of there, but I've never taken it. It's this really weird thing about the Bitcoin space is I don't think of it as real money. So I see my Bitcoin wallet expanding or shrinking as the case may be, and it doesn't bother me because it's not money that I've worked for and earned.
Yes.
It's kind of like gambling money to some extent. I look at my shares in the U.S. stock market, and
that worries you.
That does worry me. I look in terms of my retirement fund, and that does worry me. But so Bitcoin is kind of a different category. But,
well, I ask.
But this is not about me and Bitcoin.
Yes.
Because you
you didn't need to tell
because
that,
the crucial thing,
story.
right now, if you look in terms of Bitcoin,
we're about $70,000.
Yeah, but I've been looking with interest at the rand price, and a single Bitcoin is now sitting at 1.3 million rand, which is pretty much the highest
it's ever been.
The highest it's ever been. So a couple of things to understand around what's happening in terms of the Bitcoin space. And the first thing is that Bitcoin has actually gone mainstream. And it's gone mainstream in the sense that you have all of the U.S. Providers of ETFs, of exchange-traded funds, who've been given the green light by the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission in the U.S., to actually list Bitcoin ETFs.
Yeah.
And so, the likes of BlackRock and so forth are now playing in the space.
And the big banks.
Yes. And so what's happened is that immediately at the point at which they get involved, there's this veneer of respectability that then comes in because, people who know nothing about Bitcoin, but they do know that they have investments that they have with these big guys, they'll say, oh, okay, I'm going to buy the Bitcoin ETF. And that's created huge pressure now on the supply of Bitcoin. And the direct result is that whenever the supply is constrained, the price goes up, which is the way in which markets are meant to be working. So I think the interesting thing about this is that but the overall impact of that also translated to another level because the U.S. government was holding a fair amount of Bitcoin. And the reason why the U.S. government was holding a fair amount of Bitcoin is that they confiscated.
Yes.
Not
just Bitcoin, a whole bunch of the cryptos.
You see, the rest of us steal things. The U.S. government
confiscates
things.
Yes.
And so surprisingly, so what happens is the SEC gives the go-ahead to these guys to set up these ETFs. The ETFs then go through the roof, dramatically increasing the demand for Bitcoin. Which means that the price then goes through the roof, and then the U.S. government then takes all of these, the Bitcoin that it's confiscated, and then sells it on the market, and then pockets the money. And if you don't believe in conspiracy theories, well, I've got a bridge in New York I'd like to sell you.
Yes. Well, no, I don't think that's a conspiracy at all. The U.S. government obviously trades they trade in bonds commonly, and there's no reason why they wouldn't be trading in cryptocurrency as well as moving large amounts of money around the world as well. Sometimes to the Iranians on pellets in the middle of the night. I think it's interesting because we've been discussing Bitcoin for a very long time. And again, it's one of those things where we get to say, you and I and others in this space get to say, we've been talking about this since the mainstream kind of press and business folk wrote off Bitcoin as essentially a Ponzi scheme, etc. They still sometimes like to talk about it like that. It's just interesting to me because it's obviously gone up and down many times. I think it will come down again, by the way. Obviously, there will be lulls in it, and there isn't complete stability in the crypto market. So if you said to me, look, in a year's time, crypto is going to be at $20,000, not 70, I'd say, yeah, I can believe that might occur. We were at $20,000 8 months ago. I think it is.
Well, two things to that point. Okay, the one thing that I point out is that gold has also been peaking. We've been seeing all-time highs in the price of gold.
Yes, and Bitcoin does seem to track
Bitcoin
relatively well.
generally tracks the price of gold relatively well, and the reason why the price of gold is going through the roof is because the Russians and the Chinese have been net buyers of gold for the past 2 years. The Chinese in particular have been dramatically ramping up their supplies of gold, and they've been slowly and steadily divesting themselves of their stockpiles of US dollars. They obviously don't want to cause a crash by just getting rid of it all the time.
They also have a big problem in the sense that they're owed a lot of money in USD. So the Americans run a massive deficit with the Chinese.
Yes.
And so if you crash the US dollar,
yes, you're never going to get that money.
Well, you can get it back, but the Americans will say, "Here's $100," or "Here's $200 billion or whatever we owe you. By the way, it's not worth more than 100 used to be." So you've got to play a careful game with that. But that entire thing you're talking about was all triggered as a result of what's happened with Russia and Ukraine.
Correct,
and
yes.
the Biden administration making some very bad decisions in that regard, and essentially causing a new hegemony, a global hegemony to occur.
So if I give you, because subsequent to Bitcoin, there've been a lot of other coins that have come along.
Yes.
Some of them have had greater longevity than others. So Ethereum has been around for quite a while, but someone else was sharing this stat of there's a new scam coin in circulation. Okay, 27 trillion in circulation in terms of value, an unlimited supply cap. There's only one node that's producing it, and 25% of the supply was minted in the last 6 months, and 1% of the holders own 30% of the entire supply of the coin. And
okay. So what coin is that?
It's the US dollar.
Lovely.
So,
Lovely.
because there's a lot of people who've been saying, what is the intrinsic value of Bitcoin? And I say, guys, what is the intrinsic value of the US dollar?
So this is the problem, and this is the issue. And I suppose, for the podcast, if you get one thing that's kind of the Overton window and sort of moves you away from your general thinking on fiat currency, on the notes you use every day. This idea, I'm sure a lot of people who will listen to the podcast already, because they're people you're in our circle already. But the reality is that when you go to Checkers and give them R100 note to buy your groceries, your milk and your bread, the only reason they respect that money and take it and give you milk and bread in return is because of a belief. We all have a belief in the South African rand, essentially. It's a collective delusion, right? That's essentially, that paper is just paper. But that paper is blessed with the government, by the Reserve Bank and the Mint, and it's recognized by everyone in the country and millions of people outside of the country. And so it has value by that nature. And the idea that people can't understand that about cryptocurrencies has always been quite humorous to me. It's the same type of idea. Now, the value of something like Bitcoin, of course, is that you talk about supply and demand. There isn't much supply left of Bitcoin. In about 6 years' time, we're probably going to stop. We're going to run out of supply. So Bitcoin happens.
It will eventually hit 21 million. And
then, So, or it'll get very, very close. At the point it gets very close to the total volume that's meant to be created, it becomes actually very difficult and energy intensive to produce, and probably not worthwhile, depending on what the price is at that point. But the issue is that it won't happen as what you've just described. So 25% of the US dollar that exists in circulation has been printed in the last 2-3 years. And
no, in the last 6 months.
Oh, is that the last? Because from 2020 to 2023. So
in fact, the Biden administration has printed more US dollars than were ever minted in the history of the US dollar.
No, but that was already a statistic that was accurate in 2023.
Yes, correct.
So more than a year ago.
Yeah, and so right now, there's essentially what you're running a deficit of $1 trillion every couple of months, and
So social security in the United States, it's interesting. This has become quite a topic this week, actually. Social security in the United States cannot essentially be afforded. So you've got people who've been saving up their pensions for 40 years, and that money does not exist in reality.
So to tie this now in with the first part of our conversation, where we were talking about Mashaba and
principles,
and principles, but also I promise you, if you pull in John Steenhuisen as an example, and have the same conversation around how the money supply works, how printing of money affects the country, what one should be doing in terms of tying in the way in which you control the money supply to the prosperity of the country, because effectively what they are doing in the US is they are artificially propping it up by printing money. And we know that it doesn't work at one level, but when you have the US dollar, which is basically the international currency of reserve, then you do have the ability to print money, because you end up essentially enforcing the value of that because of the fact that you control the exchange rates around the world. But the likes of Mashaba and Steenhuisen would not be able to see the opportunities that exist in terms of actually trying to tie monetary policy to the way in which we end up running the economy. And this is a very crucial thing for us to be, applying our minds to, because in most parts of the world, the Reserve Bank has the ability to print money.
Yeah.
All right. In South Africa, it doesn't happen because we are constrained based on the Constitution at a very fundamental level, because the first responsibility of the Reserve Bank is to defend the value of the currency, to keep inflation within particular constraints. Now, against that backdrop, would it be possible for us to frame a monetary policy in a way that we could actually be printing money, but it doesn't have inflationary consequences? And I'm saying the answer to that is yes. Okay, so let me give you a very specific example.
Yeah, you're going to have to expand it a little bit.
Okay, so if you are printing money and distributing it to people, you're not you're ending up with inflation, okay, because the productive value of that is actually not being spread across the board. On the other hand, if you print money to do other things, let's say, as an example, we produce gold.
Yeah.
Okay. Currently, we produce gold in our mines and we export the gold. What if you had a scenario, and I'm tossing this out as right now as a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment that we need to apply our minds to. What if the Reserve Bank goes to the mines and say, I'm buying your supply of gold, and here's the money that I printed for it? What is the overall impact on the economy? My point is it's not going to be inflationary. Because all you are doing is that the Reserve Bank itself is acquiring that supply of gold, but it's just simply deferring the overall exchange of that for foreign currency. So I'm saying that there's not going to be an inflationary knock-on effect that's going to come from doing something like that.
Okay.
All right. So let's park that as one specific example. Why would we want to be doing that? All right. So right now there are a lot of things that we currently do that actually don't benefit us as a country. So we're a net exporter of steel, but we can't afford to do infrastructure projects because steel is priced at international levels, which actually hinders us as a country. So China and Russia and India don't have a problem with that, because what they do is they actually first they
supply their own.
They first supply their own, and then they ensure that they're building their own infrastructure. But going back to the starting point, I'm saying that this is not a conversation that you're likely to have with a Mashaba or a Steenhuisen or a Maimane, because the fundamentals of trying to get their heads around the interplay between the banking system, the Reserve Bank ability to print currency, the way in which exchange rates are set. All of these are things that they are completely clueless about.
Who is knowledgeable about
I'm
this
saying,
stuff?
so a lot of the BRICS economists are actually knowledgeable. So if you look in terms of the way in which India is currently running its economy, China is running its economy, Russia is running its economy, Brazil as well.
Because this
Yeah.
printing argument's been made before. Not I haven't heard it in the buy the gold from the gold mines, but I've heard it as spend money on infrastructure, essentially. So
Yes.
so you print money.
Another good example, because there's not going to be inflationary consequences in terms of spending it, because you're not giving money to people
Yes.
who are then going out to spend it on consumables.
The problem, my concern with that does come into the fact that, look, money, any economy is designed on the fact that money flows generally. So
Sure.
if you, for example, spend it on infrastructure, let's say you turn around and go, let's use a project that would be a very good idea. We're going to build a railway, an express railway between Johannesburg and Durban, 3 tracks, 1 passenger and 2 cargo. High-speed rail, the whole works. And as best as you can with cargo, because you can't put all cargo on high speed, obviously, because if you crash certain things at speed, boom. But point is, you do this express railway between Joburg and Durban. You expand the port at the same time so that you can increase capacity there. These would all be very good things for the country. The reality, though, is that the money still goes into the system. You do still increase supply of rand. So if you go and print, say, 2 trillion rand to do this, and you then put that into the system, the reality is that the people building the railways is a company. The company still contracts individuals, whether it be a worker literally putting a rail pin in, or whether it be an engineer designing the track. And those people then go out and do buy commodities with or consumables with the money. So that's my concern on that sort of theory. It's not your idea of, okay, we're going to give you the money for the gold, then you at least increase your gold reserves. And gold, because gold is a commodity and the most widely respected commodity in many ways, that maybe scuppers my argument. But when you give it to infrastructure projects, ultimately ends up in the hands of individuals, and individuals are humans, and humans buy shit when they have money.
So I'm saying that we need to think differently about it. So there are components in terms of the human handling part of it, and then there are the very real hard costs that accrue in terms of infrastructure. And so let's use steel as the most fundamental building block, because you can't really do any construction without steel. And meanwhile, what we are doing is we are pricing our steel at import parity level, which means that the cost of construction in our country has basically gone through the roof ever since we entered the open market.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a separate discussion around whether closing off particular sections of the market actually makes sense.
Well, if you're keeping steel inside the country, it should
Yes.
certainly be sold at a lower cost.
Exactly. But again, using the same example that I've just done in terms of the gold, okay, what if the Reserve Bank just simply says at that level that, no, actually we're going to buy all of the iron that's being produced, and here we're printing money and we're going to pay it across to you. If you look at the impact of the Ukraine war, and more crucially the sanctions in terms of what happened with Russia, it turned Russia self-sufficient in almost everything. And I keep looking at this business model in terms of what we have in our country right now. And we are self-sufficient in almost every level except, very crucially, for crude oil.
We could be self-sufficient in crude oil.
We could be self-sufficient in crude oil. We haven't started exploiting.
We choose
fracking.
not to drill.
We choose not to drill. But I'm saying that this idea right now that everything gets traded freely on the open market, where we are simply plucking out minerals from the ground, shipping them and not actually turning that into solid infrastructure projects like the rail system, for example. And the overall impact of the rail system, so I touched on this in my book, where fixing the rail system is a core part of what we need to do. And by the way, fixing the rail system and running high-speed rail, we can actually do on our existing infrastructure. Because, yes, Japan ended up building the first bullet trains, but Japan also has a substantial investment in Cape Gauge, because it was essentially transplanted from here. Most of sub-Saharan Africa runs on Cape Gauge, and there are some parts of the world.
Just so for those who don't know, that's the track
that's the track. That's the width of the track. Yes, yeah. So and Japan actually runs 160 kilometer per hour trains on Cape Gauge, and all it required was modification in terms of how the tracks were actually laid down. The tolerance between the tracks needs to be very specific when you're doing high speed, because tracks tend to expand and contract depending on changes in weather and so forth. But there are the most obvious thing that you do is you end up not using wooden sleepers, and so there's lots of things that go along those lines. My crucial point being, though, that if you can actually fix the rail network, the overall impact on the economy ends up being massive. And that in turn generates real wealth that in fact grows the economy. And so this idea of fiddling with the Reserve Bank in order to acquire resources which then get plowed back into the development of the country is a serious conversation that needs to be had. And right now, the political leadership of this country is incapable of thinking along those lines.
Completely. We as I said, the manifestos, go look at the manifestos. They are dilutions of ideas the ANC has. Instead of turning around and going, most of the ideas the ANC has are bad ideas. And when they're not just dilutional ANC, they're dilutional sort of general global policy, which probably doesn't apply here, because there's a lot of things that you may want your country to do. You may want us to look like Belgium or Finland or New Zealand, but the reality is we're very far from there. And so those solutions are not our solutions right now. They may be if we do the right things for 30 years, but they're not. And so there's not a lot of this type of thinking. There's very sparse discussion about really groundbreaking changes. Even I look at energy, and I look at the policy around energy that's taking place in the manifestos. Everyone's terrified of nuclear. It's just unbelievable to me. The Australians are busy freaking out because the Australian government, who happens to be left-wing currently, are looking at building a nuclear power plant in Melbourne. In Melbourne. Not 300 kilometers from Melbourne, in Melbourne. And that's the correct thing to do, because nuclear is perfectly safe. And it's...
Well, not perfectly safe, but it's certainly safer than... Well, I would go so far as to say that a nuclear power plant is safer than a coal-fired power plant.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
To put that in perspective. But the other thing that people fail to take into account, and nearly everyone says, let's look at Chernobyl, let's look at Fukushima, let's look at 3 Mile Island. So the most crucial thing in terms of Fukushima is that it was a water-cooled reactor.
Yeah.
And 2 dramatic changes have happened recently, and I'm talking in the past 5-year period, around nuclear reactors. The first is, instead of it being cooled by water, you use liquid helium to cool the reactors. So what happens if you have a breach? What happens with helium? Helium is lighter than air.
Disappears.
It just goes straight up into the atmosphere. Then the second innovation has been to use liquefied sodium to cool the reactors. And what happens if you have a breach? Well, when exposed to air, sodium promptly solidifies. Mm-hmm. So again, you're not going to have a Fukushima-type scenario. All of these
that together with the way pebble bed reactors, for example, work.
Yes, because they're manageable at a small level.
Exactly. Means that meltdowns are very borderline impossible, but if they were to occur, would be essentially irrelevant, site specific. Look, we must have a conversation about nuclear another time, because that is definitely an entire, potentially an entire podcast around nuclear. But it just points to one of those issues. And you talk about monetary policy, you talk about finance, how any future government, which we may have a different government in June. I personally don't think we will, but and I again hope I'm wrong. But we may have a different government in June, but none of them are thinking with any kind of interesting, innovative way of dealing with our problems and making us more prosperous and more of a powerhouse, really, which we should be. We once were in some respects, and we should be again in many respects. And that's just really disappointing. But I think on that lovely note, we need to call it quits, Kanthan. We've been going for about an hour and a half.
All right, well, let's call it quits at that point. Sorry, we didn't have time to talk about the other fun stuff that we had on the agenda.
Yeah, we'll
get to that in 2 weeks' time.
We'll keep it for 2 weeks' time. If you have enjoyed the podcast, please do tell your friends about it. Pass it on. I think at the moment the biggest thing is really word of mouth. And trying to increase the listenership base at this stage. Numbers for the first podcast were pretty good, and I'm sure they will grow. You can subscribe to the Overton Press Substack. It's overtonpress.substack.com. And obviously this podcast is available on all platforms, I think. If it's not, please do let us know, and we will rectify that. But it should be available across all your podcast platforms, as well as on YouTube if you really want to see our faces. Personally, my worst part of the podcast, but hey, everyone's got their own thing. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Cheers. Bye.